The last supply train had arrived on October 14th, 1887. It had brought flour, salt pork, tinned beef, coffee, sugar, and all the provisions that the people of Silverton, Nevada, had come to depend upon as surely as they depended on air and water. The train had departed that same afternoon, heading back down the mountain toward the junction at Elko, and no one in Silverton had given it a second thought. Another train would come in 2 weeks, as trains always came, bringing the goods that kept the mining town alive. That train never arrived. The trestle bridge at Morgan's Gorge collapsed on October 19th, weakened by summer floods and autumn rains, giving way beneath the weight of an eastbound freight. The locomotive and 12 cars plunged 200 feet into the canyon below, killing the engineer and fireman instantly, destroying the only rail connection between Silverton and the outside world. The nearest alternative route was 160 miles of mountain road that would become impassable within weeks as winter closed the high passes. Silverton was cut off, and Silverton had perhaps 6 weeks of food remaining. The panic began slowly, as panic often does, building from whispered concerns to public arguments to the grim realization that mathematics did not lie. 437 people, 6 weeks of supplies, a winter that would last at least 5 months. The numbers did not add up, and no amount of rationing could make them work. By December, the flour was gone. By January, the salt pork and tinned beef had been consumed to the last scrap. The hunting parties that ventured into the mountains returned with less and less. The game had moved to lower elevations, beyond the reach of men trapped by snow that had drifted 20 feet deep in the passes. The people of Silverton were facing starvation, the slow wasting death that came when the body consumed itself for lack of anything else to consume. But on the eastern edge of town, in a modest house with a root cellar that extended deep into the hillside, Prudence Calloway descended a wooden ladder and surveyed her wealth. 800 glass jars lined the shelves her husband had built before the fever took him. Jars filled with preserved vegetables, fruits, meats, and sauces that glowed like jewels in the lantern light. Tomatoes the color of rubies, green beans like emeralds, peaches in syrup that caught the light like amber, venison and rabbit and elk, pressure canned according to methods her grandmother had perfected in the farmlands of Pennsylvania. They had called her mad for filling those jars. They had said the food would spoil, that canning was an Eastern affectation unsuited to the frontier, that a widow wasting her time on glass jars and boiling water was evidence of a mind unhinged by grief. The storekeeper had refused to sell her more jars after the first 300, claiming he would not contribute to her foolishness. She had ordered the rest from Elko, paying shipping costs that had made her neighbors shake their heads in pity. Now the storekeeper's shelves were bare. The supply train was a pile of wreckage at the bottom of Morgan's Gorge, and Prudence Calloway's 800 jars held perhaps the only substantial food supply remaining in Silverton. She climbed back up the ladder into the gray January light and looked toward the town that had dismissed her. Smoke rose from chimneys where families were burning their furniture to stay warm. The streets were empty, too cold to venture out, too hungry to have anywhere worth going. The children would be crying by now. Children always cried when there was nothing left to eat. Her chestnut mare, Sage, nickered from the small stable. Prudence had named her for the scrubby plants that covered the Nevada hillsides, hardy and persistent in conditions that killed more delicate things. "They'll come today," she said to the horse, "or tomorrow. Pride can only hold out so long against an empty stomach." Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the mountains, the mining country, or somewhere the supply lines run just as thin. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the trains stop running and the only food left is what one woman refused to stop preserving. Prudence had come to Nevada in the spring of 1882, following her husband, Martin, who had heard that the silver mines of the Comstock region were hiring skilled carpenters at wages that seemed like dreams compared to what he earned in Pennsylvania. They had sold their small farm, loaded their possessions into a wagon, and made the long journey west with the optimism of people who believed that hard work and good fortune would see them through. Martin had found work immediately. The mines always needed carpenters to shore up tunnels and build the infrastructure of extraction. And Prudence had set about creating a home in this strange, dry land that seemed determined to resist all her efforts. The soil was rocky and alkaline, unsuited to the vegetables she had grown in Pennsylvania. The climate swung between brutal heat and bitter cold, with none of the moderate seasons she was accustomed to. The nearest reliable water source was a spring 2 miles from town, and the nearest supply of fresh food was the railroad depot at Elko, 60 miles away. She had adapted, as pioneers always adapted, but she had also refused to abandon the skills that had sustained her family for generations. Her grandmother, Eliza Calloway, had been a master of food preservation, canning, pickling, smoking, drying, every technique known to the farm wives of the eastern states. Eliza had taught Prudence's mother, and Prudence's mother had taught her, and now Prudence carried knowledge that stretched back through generations of women who understood that summer's abundance had to be captured if winter's scarcity was to be survived. In Pennsylvania, this knowledge had been common. Every farm wife canned. Every cellar held rows of preserved food that would see families through the months when nothing grew. But in Nevada, things were different. The mining towns had grown up around the railroad, dependent on regular shipments from the outside world. Why preserve food when fresh supplies arrived every 2 weeks? Why spend hours over boiling water when tinned beef could be purchased at the company store? The old ways seemed unnecessary in a world where commerce had replaced self-sufficiency. Prudence had disagreed. She had seen what happened when supply lines failed, during the war, during droughts, during the economic panics that periodically swept through the country. She had learned from her grandmother that the only food you could truly depend upon was the food you preserved yourself. So she had planted a garden in the rocky Nevada soil, coaxing vegetables from ground that resisted her efforts. She had traded with the hunters who came through Silverton, exchanging her preserved goods for fresh game that she could can for later use. She had saved every jar, every lid, every ring, treating them as the precious resources they were. Martin had supported her efforts, building the root cellar that would keep her jars cool and dark, constructing the shelves that would hold her growing collection, never questioning why his wife spent so many hours doing work that their neighbors considered pointless. He had understood, in the way that good husbands sometimes understand without needing explanation, that this was important to her in ways that went beyond practicality. He had died in the spring of 1885, taken by a fever that swept through the mining camps, leaving Prudence a widow at 34 with a small house, a root cellar full of preserved food, and no reason to stay in Nevada except that she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed, and she had continued to can. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. The people of Silverton had noticed her efforts, and they had not approved. Emmett Sloan owned the general store that served as the commercial heart of the town, and he considered himself an authority on all matters of frontier life. He was a lean, calculating man who had built his business on the simple principle that miners needed supplies, and he was the only one selling them. A woman who preserved her own food was a woman who did not need Emmett Sloan, and he took such independence personally. "The Calloway widow is filling jars again," Sloan announced at his store one summer afternoon, where the townspeople gathered to purchase goods and exchange gossip. "Must have 300 of them by now, all lined up in that cellar of hers. Claims they'll keep for years. I give them until Christmas before they spoil and poison whoever's foolish enough to eat them." The laughter had been immediate. Canned food spoiling was a common fear. Improperly sealed jars could harbor deadly bacteria, and stories of families sickened by bad preserves circulated regularly through frontier communities. That a widow with no formal training was attempting what professional canneries sometimes failed at seemed like hubris at best, suicide at worst. "She'll kill herself with those jars," predicted Ida Hollister, the wife of the mine superintendent, who considered herself the social arbiter of Silverton. "Or worse, she'll share them and kill someone else. The woman should be stopped before she poisons half the town." The whisper campaign intensified over the following years. Prudence was wasting her time. Prudence was courting death. Prudence was touched by grief, seeking meaning in useless labor because she could not face the emptiness of her widowhood. The preserved food she offered to share at church socials was politely declined. The jars she tried to give to families with sick children were refused with barely concealed horror. "We don't eat from unlabeled jars," Ida Hollister had told her, turning away from a jar of preserved peaches that Prudence had offered when the Hollister baby was teething. "One never knows what might be in them." Prudence had stopped offering. She had continued canning. By the autumn of 1887, her cellar held 800 jars, the accumulation of 5 years of patient work, representing thousands of hours of labor and hundreds of pounds of preserved food. Vegetables from her garden, fruit purchased from travelers and preserved before it could spoil, meat from hunters who were happy to trade for the canned goods that Prudence produced, even if the townspeople would not accept them. Her cellar had become a repository of abundance in a town that assumed abundance would always arrive by rail. The trestle collapse changed everything. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The first weeks after the collapse had been marked by denial. Surely the railroad would be repaired. Surely supplies would be brought in by wagon. Surely someone from the outside world would realize that Silverton was trapped and organize a rescue. The people waited, rationed their food carefully, and trusted that the systems they depended upon would not fail them. The systems failed them. The railroad company announced that the trestle would take until spring to rebuild. The gorge was too deep, the terrain too difficult, the winter too close for construction to proceed. The wagon road that might have provided an alternative was already buried under the first heavy snowfalls, impassable until the thaw. Silverton was on its own, with whatever provisions remained within its borders. The rationing began immediately, organized by Mayor Thaddeus Whitmore with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that mathematics did not negotiate. Every household supplies were inventoried. Distribution was centralized through the general store, which Emmett Sloan continued to operate even though he had nothing left to sell. Hunting parties were organized, foraging teams dispatched, every possible source of food identified and allocated. It was not enough. It could never be enough. 437 people could not survive 5 months on 6 weeks of provisions, no matter how carefully those provisions were managed. The first death from starvation came in late December. Old Josiah Crane, a retired miner who had no family to share food with him and too much pride to ask for help. They found him in his cabin, wasted to nothing, having given his final rations to a neighbor's children because he could not bear to watch them suffer. His death was a warning that no one could ignore. The second death followed in early January. Then the third. The weakest were failing first. The elderly, the sick, the very young whose bodies could not sustain themselves on the watered-down broths and grass soups that passed for meals. Silverton was dying, slowly and inexorably, consumed by a famine that should never have been possible in a town that had seemed so prosperous. It was young Sarah Whitmore, the mayor's daughter, who finally spoke the words that pride had forbidden. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, approaching Prudence after church on a Sunday when the sermon had been about faith in times of trial. "The jars in your cellar, the preserved food you've been making for years. Is it—" She hesitated, struggling with the admission. "Is it still good?" Prudence looked at the young woman, 18 years old, gaunt from rationing, her eyes holding the desperate hope of someone who had watched her neighbors die and feared she would be next. "It's still good," Prudence said. 800 jars, properly sealed, properly stored. Vegetables, fruits, meats, enough to make a difference. "Why haven't you—" Sarah stopped, unable to complete the question. "Why haven't I offered it to people who spent 5 years telling me it would spoil and poison anyone who ate it?" Prudence's voice was even, without anger, stating facts rather than accusations. "I did offer, once, many times. I was refused. I was told that one never knows what might be in unlabeled jars." Sarah's face flushed with shame. "We were wrong. Everyone was wrong. Mrs. Calloway, people are dying. Children are starving. If your food is good—" "It is good. Then will you help us, even after how we treated you?" Prudence was silent for a long moment, considering the question. 5 years of mockery, 5 years of whispers, 5 years of having her offerings refused and her skills dismissed. The town had called her mad, had called her dangerous, had treated her preservation efforts as evidence of a broken mind rather than valuable knowledge. Now they needed her. Now the jars they had said would spoil were the only substantial food supply remaining. "Bring people to my cellar," Prudence said finally. "Families with children first, then the elderly, then everyone else. I'll show them what I have. I'll teach them how to use it. And I'll ask nothing in return except that they learn, that they watch and remember so they can preserve their own food when this is over." The distribution began that afternoon. Prudence opened her cellar to the people of Silverton, revealing the abundance that had been hidden beneath their feet while they starved above. 800 jars, organized by content and date, each one labeled in Prudence's neat handwriting with exactly what it contained and when it had been preserved. The colors glowed in the lantern light. Red tomatoes, green beans, golden peaches, dark preserved meats. A rainbow of sustenance that seemed to belong to a different world than the gray, hungry one above. The first jar she opened was tomatoes, preserved in the summer of 1886. She passed it around, letting the skeptics smell the contents, examine the seal, see for themselves that the food was perfect, as fresh and wholesome as the day it had been canned, its color bright, its texture firm, its aroma exactly what preserved tomatoes should smell like. "How is this possible?" breathed Ida Hollister, who had once turned away Prudence's peaches with barely concealed horror. "It's been over a year. How is it not spoiled?" "Because I know what I'm doing," Prudence said simply. "My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. The seals are good, the processing was proper, the storage is cool and dark. Food preserved correctly will last for years, not months." She began distributing, carefully, methodically, stretching her supplies as far as they could go. Each family received enough to supplement whatever meager rations they had remaining, transforming meals of watered broth into soups with substance, replacing the grass and bark that desperate people had been eating with actual vegetables and meat. 800 jars could not feed 400 people indefinitely, but they could make the difference between survival and starvation for the weeks remaining until spring. More importantly, Prudence taught. Every family that came to her cellar left with knowledge as well as food. She showed them her methods, the jars and lids she used, the boiling and processing techniques, the signs of proper sealing, and the dangers of improper preservation. She explained what she had learned from her grandmother, knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that abundance had to be captured to survive scarcity. "This is not complicated," she told them again and again. "Any of you can do this. The equipment is simple. The techniques can be learned. The only thing required is the willingness to do the work before it is needed." The supplies lasted 11 weeks. 11 weeks of supplemented meals, of vegetable soups and fruit preserves and canned meat that kept families alive when everything else had failed. 11 weeks of gradual improvement as the worst of the starvation was pushed back and bodies began to recover from the edge of death. 11 weeks of learning as the women of Silverton watched Prudence work and absorbed knowledge that their grandmothers had possessed, but their generation had forgotten. No more deaths came after the jars were opened. The children who had been wasting away began to regain weight. The elderly who had been failing found strength returning. The town that had been dying began, slowly, to live again. The railroad was repaired on March 23, 1888. The first supply train arrived the following day, bringing provisions that were no longer desperately needed, but still deeply welcomed. Silverton had survived the impossible winter, had endured a 5-month siege with only 6 weeks of official supplies, had lost only 4 people to starvation instead of the dozens or hundreds that mathematics had predicted. And everyone knew why. The gathering came in April, held in the town square where the spring sunshine was finally melting, the last of the winter's snow. The survivors of Silverton assembled to acknowledge what had happened, to reckon with their mistakes, honor their savior, and commit to a future where such a disaster could never happen again. Mayor Whitmore spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of a winter that had nearly destroyed everything he was responsible for. 5 years ago, a widow named Prudence Calloway began preserving food in jars while the rest of us laughed. We called her mad. We said her food would spoil. We refused to eat what she offered because we were certain we knew better than a woman who had learned from her grandmother in Pennsylvania. He paused, his jaw tight with emotion. This winter, when the railroad failed and the supplies ran out and people began to die, that same widow opened her cellar and fed us from the jars we had mocked. 800 jars, 11 weeks of supplemented meals, 4 deaths instead of 40 or 400. We are standing here today because Prudence Calloway knew something we did not. and she saved us anyway. Emmett Sloan rose next. The storekeeper who had refused to sell Prudence more jars, who had predicted that her preserves would spoil by Christmas, stood before the community he had helped mislead. "I told people her food was dangerous," Sloan confessed. "I refused to stock the supplies she needed. I made her order jars from 60 miles away because I would not contribute to her foolishness." His voice cracked. "My children ate from those jars this winter. My wife is alive because of food I tried to prevent her from making. I do not know how to apologize for being so wrong." Ida Hollister spoke next, the woman who had turned away the peaches, who had said one never knew what might be in unlabeled jars. "I was cruel," Ida said, tears streaming down her face. "I was cruel, and I was stupid, and I was wrong. Mrs. Calloway offered help when my baby was sick, and I refused it because I thought I was better than her. This winter, that same baby ate peaches from the jars I rejected, and she lived when she might have died. I have no words for what I did or how I feel." Others spoke. The families who had survived on Prudence's preserves, the women who had learned her techniques and now understood what their grandmothers had known, the children who had been fed from jars that their parents had called poison. When the confessions were complete, Prudence rose and walked to the center of the assembly. She was 41 now, weathered by 5 years of Nevada sun and wind, her hands calloused from the work that had saved 400 lives. She had not sought this moment, had not wanted it, but she understood that some things needed to be said. "My grandmother used to tell me that every jar was a promise," she said. "A promise to your future self, to your family, to anyone who might need food when the growing season was past. She said the work was hard and the hours were long, but the promise was worth keeping." She looked around at the faces of those who had mocked her. "You did not understand the promise. You thought the trains would always run, the stores would always be full, the supplies would always arrive. You forgot what your grandmothers knew, that abundance is temporary, that scarcity is inevitable, that the only food you can truly depend upon is the food you preserve yourself." She paused. "I do not ask for gratitude. I do not ask for apology. I ask only that you remember. Next summer, when the gardens grow and the fruit ripens and the game is plentiful, I ask that you remember this winter. I ask that you fill your own jars, learn your own techniques, make your own promises to your future selves." She gestured toward the mountains that had trapped them. "The railroad will fail again. It always does, eventually. The trains will stop, the supplies will end, the winter will come. When it does, let Silverton be ready. Let every cellar hold its own abundance. Let no one ever again depend entirely on a system that can collapse in a moment." Thank you for watching this story about Prudence Calloway and the 800 jars of Silverton. When we mock the cautious, we often find ourselves dependent on their foresight. If this story reminded you that the old ways carry wisdom, the new ways have forgotten, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed your preparations as foolish until the day those preparations saved them? That summer, Silverton transformed. Every household with a garden began preserving. Prudence taught classes 3 times a week, showing women and men alike how to seal jars, process food safely, recognize the signs of proper preservation. The general store, under new management, as Emmett Sloan had sold his business and left town, stocked canning supplies in quantities that would have seemed absurd a year before. By autumn, the root cellars of Silverton held thousands of jars. The town that had nearly starved had become a community of preservers, each family maintaining its own supply of abundance against whatever winter might come. The phrase "keeping the promise" entered the vocabulary of the Nevada mining country. It meant preserving food during times of plenty, honoring the future by preparing for its needs. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned through nearly starving. Prudence Calloway remarried in 1891, a widower named Thomas Brennan, who had lost his first wife to the same fever that had taken Martin. Together, they raised 3 children and taught every one of them to can. Her techniques spread across the territory, carried by women who had learned from her during the desperate winter and passed the knowledge to their daughters and granddaughters. She passed in the spring of 1912 at the age of 65, still filling jars until her hands could no longer grip the tools. Her final harvest, 63 jars of preserved tomatoes from the summer of 1911, remained on her shelves for years after her death, opened one at a time by family members who wanted to taste what she had made. The root cellar still exists, maintained now by the Silverton Historical Society as a monument to the winter that nearly destroyed the town. The original shelves are empty. The jars that once filled them have long since been consumed. But replicas show how 800 jars might have looked in the lantern light, glowing like jewels in the darkness. Above the cellar door, carved in letters that Prudence added in the years after the railroad disaster, is an inscription that visitors often photograph. Every jar is a promise kept. Her grandmother Eliza, who had taught her mother, who had taught her, would have recognized the truth in those words and smiled to see how far the lesson had traveled.